everyone, and welcome to DIVA Book Club, where tonight we're welcoming acclaimed author Zaina Arafat. Together, Zoe Berryman and I run the book club, and welcome to Zaina. Zaina Arafat is a Palestinian-American author, journalist, and professor whose stories and essays have been published in publications such as the New York Times, Granta, The Believer, and many others. Tonight, we're going to be discussing You Exist Too Much, which is a novel which won the Lambda Literary Award in 2021. And in 2020, Roxane Gay said that it was her favourite book of the year. Zaina teaches creative writing at Barnard College. She's also taught the University of Iowa, the School of the New York Times, as well as abroad in Jordan, Egypt, and Eritrea, where she taught creative writing as part of a US State Department International Writing Program delegation. Zaina grew up between the US and the Middle East and joins us today from the US and is in Washington today. Welcome, Zaina.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
It is lovely to have you here, and we're so excited as well. So first of all, for those who haven't yet read You Exist Too Much, and I hope lots of people have, but if they haven't read it, can you just tell us a little bit about it from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing to know is I close my eyes when I talk and think, so don't be alarmed. But You Exist Too Much is basically a story that traces a queer LGBTQ Palestinian American woman who follows this queer Palestinian American woman as she traces a pattern of relationships against the backdrop of her Arab Muslim culture. And essentially, it's about this girl who continuously falls in love with women that are unattainable. And the book sort of explores why it is that this continuously happens, where does this pattern come from, and how does it speak to her cultural heritage and her sort of existential political reality and her identity as a queer woman, which is an identity that she's also coming to terms with over the course of the novel. So yeah, it explores like themes around home and belonging and sexual and gender identity and internalized homophobia and unrequited love. So that's essentially how I would describe the book. There's a lot of different levels and layers.
There certainly are. There are lots of layers. All those themes are layered on top of each other, and therefore it's quite complex yet really accessible, I found as well, which is a wonder really, because it is so complex. So that's amazing.
Good. I'm glad you felt that way.
And her voice is really strong and really authentic. It feels authentic when you're reading it. To what extent is it autobiographical, if at all?
Sure. So the identity markers of the character are derived from life. I myself am Palestinian American. I'm the first generation. My parents are immigrants. I am also queer. And let's see, the character lives grows up between the United States and the Middle East. And that is precisely how I grew up, between these two cultures and continents. So in those ways, I do, those are the sort of seeds of reality that underlie this book. But the specific narrative and the specific stories, and particularly the love stories, are all fabricated, because I was really interested in exploring this question around unattainability and why it is that something in the distance could be more appealing than what's right in front of you, and how that can relate to somebody's identity on cultural, social, sexual, and political levels. So all of that was pretty fabricated. But of course, I think the inquiry that question around unattainability does stem from my own experiences, in the sense of like being caught between cultures and feeling this inability to fully attain access to one culture or the other, and also kind of struggles with coming out as well, and how that shapes the contours of young relationships.
Wow, there's so much there. And you talked just then, and I remember in the book reading when there is that tug between the Middle East and the US. So I think she's spent perhaps the summer in the Middle East, feeling perhaps a little bit unfamiliar there, wanting to be back at home, if home is the US, wanting to be back at home. But then as soon as she comes home or comes back to the US, there's that tug back to Palestine. And you talked about just then about that unattainability. And so that link between perhaps geographical unattainability and then the love interest and that yearning for something. Is that right? Is there a link there?
Absolutely. So indeed there is. And sort of how it works with, and I'm glad you remember that scene of like the character kind of when she's in the Middle East, she craves the United States and, you know, that feeling, that sense of home that she gets in the States. And when she's in the States, she craves the Middle East and the sense of home she gets there. And I suppose the easiest way to answer this question is to sort of think about how it kind of evolved, which was that like I was thinking about how the sort of conditions of our youth can sort of shape a lot of the adult behaviors that we have, and that sort of in-betweenness and feeling of unattainability when it comes to a cultural home, or when it comes to home and when it comes to belonging, how that can kind of translate and into how one conducts oneself as an adult and how one's relationships sort of form, and how the central relationships in our lives, like the relationships with our parents, especially growing up, also can sort of lend themselves to how we are in romantic relationships. And so there's this sort of thread of the mother-daughter relationship and the mother belonging to this other world and therefore feeling sort of unattainable to the daughter who doesn't quite belong in that world, and also the mother sort of being very withholding as well, and the daughter constantly seeking her affection and her approval, and how that translates into this constant yearning she has for these women that sort of resemble her mom in some way and are also withholding and also can't sort of give her the love and nourishment that she craves. And so, yeah, I mean, it's sort of convoluted, but all of these circles are meant to kind of tie together in the sense that like we sort of repeat patterns from our youth as adults, and hope to eventually escape them if we can, especially if they're not leading to fruitful results.
Yeah, and so I really like that description you said about these circles, these circular patterns that the protagonist gets into. And how that's kind of repeated in adult life. And you mentioned the mother-daughter relationship. We can't really talk about this book without talking about that relationship and the mother figure in that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, why that was so important for you?
Yeah, certainly. So I was really interested in the relationship between generations, particularly between an immigrant generation, the mother, and the first generation, the daughter, right? The generation that kind of comes of age in the adopted homeland, and yet still by virtue of the parents' connection to the native homeland is also connected to that homeland. And so I was really interested in that relationship, along with this concept of, I guess, what we call like inherited trauma or intergenerational trauma, which I think of as like a sort of trickle down trauma, and how the sort of trauma of one generation impacts the next generation. Like I guess by virtue of being raised by someone that's been traumatized, like the mother is raised under occupation, is sort of subjected to this patriarchy where she has to kind of follow her husband to this new country that she doesn't want to come to. How does that all impact the daughter? And so that central relationship does span the book. It's also one of the main trajectories where it's like the mother, the two of them kind of coming to understand one another. The daughter going from a place of feeling very angry with the mother and arriving at a place of empathy and compassion for her. And the mother feeling like the daughter is sort of foreign to her, both because she grows up, in a different culture than the mother does, and because the daughter is queer, and the mother kind of coming to understand the daughter. And so this thread is like the sort of, I think of it as like the central sort of circle in which all the other relationships sort of orbit around this central relationship. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm just so interested in intergenerational dynamics in that context in particular.
Really interesting. And there's a generosity of spirit actually where that empathy comes in, because actually some of the behavior of the mother and how it's portrayed in the earlier parts of the book perhaps is really difficult. It was difficult to read. She's quite distanced and finds it difficult, I think, to give that unconditional love which the protagonist seems to be yearning for. So the reaching that empathy was a really, yeah, as I said, a generous point, I felt.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was, I mean, as a writer, it was challenging to depict that relationship and particularly that character of the mother, because, I wanted to convey the sort of ugly sides, but also, the multidimensionality that includes the lovelier sides. And that also, like, I mean, I think we sometimes forget that we evaluate like parents, and forget to think of them as like people that have their own set of traumas and experiences, and like, what do they know? And so I wanted to really sort of show all of that too, and to sort of get underneath that like, so there's just, yeah, it was hard to create her and to arrive at that place of empathy. But there was a chapter that comes later in the book where we get the mother's story and the mother's perspective in some sense that hopefully helps the reader get there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think to a certain extent, we sometimes romanticize motherhood and mother figures as well. So there was something very refreshing about reading that reality and that the converse of that romanticism.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cut through the romanticism.
And I think I'm right in thinking that the protagonist isn't named with a first name in the book, and that was quite interesting. It strengthened, I think, that real sense of identification with the narrator, that you feel you're very close as you're reading it. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that. I think at one point there's reference to the mother referring to her as, is it or a mother type name in a kind of self-referential way. But
yeah, well, that's funny because in Arab culture, like mothers call their daughter mama, and dads call their daughters like baba, which means like mom and dad. It's just this like strange custom that I've always found so interesting and funny. But it's true that the narrator has no name, and initially she had a name, and eventually I was just thinking that like one of this narrator's plights is to go from a place of feeling like she can't exist in her own right and isn't justified to exist in her own right as someone who inhabits unacceptable spaces, like as a queer person, as somebody kind of culturally in between and alienated, to feeling like she can take up space in the world and shouldn't have to apologize for that. And so I took away the name as a sort of homage to that quest that she has to like constantly take up less space and exist less, essentially. And in some of the chapters, or in some of the like relationship scenes, in certain relationships, she doesn't even like speak any lines, because that just like further sort of removing her in some way from her own life. And she's also constantly like defining herself in relation to others. Like she's her mother's daughter, she's so-and-so's lover, right? And so that was another reason why it was important to me that she not have a name. But yeah, that was the choice that came later in the process.
It's quite unusual, I think. So it was striking because of that element.
Yeah, it was logistically, it was challenging too, to like write without giving her a name, but it worked out.
Yeah, it definitely worked out. And you mentioned, I think you said about kind of existing too much, and the title of the novel, Exist Too Much, I think comes from something that her mum says to her. Right. But can you tell us a little bit about that? Because again, it's very direct, and because it's second person, it's saying you. It's almost saying to the reader as well. It's really out there. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, it's a line. You exist too much is a line in the book spoken to the daughter by the mother, and essentially, it's a command to tell someone like you should exist less, right? So which is part of where that plight, that or that impulse she has to take up very little space comes from, is that command from the mother. And that was another decision that came later in the process to make that line the title, because I just felt like it spoke so much to this character's struggle of feeling like, you know, she can't take up space in the world, feeling shamed to exist as one does, and would also sort of implicate the reader and anyone that's ever felt that way. Because sometimes I'll encounter readers who will hear that title and be like, oh, okay, whatever. And other times I'll encounter readers that'll be like, oh my God, like I totally get that. Like that is exactly how I feel, you know, or I felt before. And so, yeah, it was, that's where that all sort of came from.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I was going to ask kind of how that was received by readers, but you've kind of explained.
I am so happy with the title, just because I feel like it just captures everything I would want to capture in one sentence, in some sense, or not. I mean, it just captures a lot. And titles are so hard. Like they're just so hard to abstract one word or two words or a sentence from an entire book to try and capture it. But that one feels like it fits.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm.
And you talked about the so the kind of pattern of relationships or encounters that the protagonist has, the narrator has, with a series of women. But there are also relationships or encounters with men as well. I wondered, first of all, did you define her as bisexual? And if so, how important was that? Is it important?
You know, it's interesting because people sometimes when they talk about the book, they describe her as bisexual. And I never think of her as bisexual, just because I never think in the specific categories of the LGBTQ plus acronym necessarily. Which is, I think, why I often use the word queer, is because I feel like they're so, I don't know, limiting. It's like I think of her as someone who dates women, but also dates men. And that's just that. And indeed, yeah, she does have, I mean, there's one of the central relationships is with a man, and she falls in love with him. And I always forget almost that it is a man versus a woman. And I don't think about those. I really genuinely, it sounds really like, I don't know, woke, but like I genuinely don't think about those distinctions for some reason. I just think of like a fluidity. And I was so much more interested in like the patterns and the behaviors than the like gender, I guess, of the love interests, and the sort of that I guess I didn't really think about it.
Well, I think that's really refreshing, because it means that although, so to a certain extent, her sexual orientation is referred to, that it's a thing with her mum, I think, but it's not the whole point,
right,
of those relationships.
Exactly that. Like, it's funny because on one hand, it's coming out is a theme of this book. On the other hand, it's not a coming out novel, because it's not like the whole book is it's not, the point of the relationships isn't about the fact that they're furtive and hidden, and the point is like what is with the sort of destructive patterns within these relationships, and where are they deriving from? And they could have just as well been men almost, but not really entirely, because a lot of what is dictating the pattern is internalized homophobia and internalized shame, which can look very ugly and is hard to sort of depict because of the ugliness that it can manifest, or the ugly behaviors it can manifest, because some of the things she does, I find they were hard to write, because I was like, oh, I wish she wouldn't do that. Don't do that. But she does them because she has all this sort of shame that she's carrying that that can lead to self-destructive behaviors. So yeah, long answer.
It sounds almost as though once you'd conceived of her and built her as a character, that she almost took on a life of her own. If you're saying, oh, please don't do that, that's really interesting.
100%. Like, I mean, I feel like to have the fuel to write a novel, it has to somewhat at some point take on a life of its own, because like it's too much work if it doesn't. But she would truly, I would like close my computer at the end of the day and go for a run and think to myself like, oh, I can't wait to find out what she does next. And then I'd return in the morning to write, and I would, my fingers would just do things and I would be watching her almost. and feeling like, oh, wow, oh, she's going to do that. Oh, she's really going to do that. Like, don't do that or do that. But I couldn't control her because I had to allow her, because it wouldn't have been authentic. Because I think my impulse would have been to make her do the right thing, or the whatever I thought the right thing was. But that would not have been authentic to the sort of traumas and the sort of shame motivated behavior and all of what she was trying to overcome. So I had to just let her do her own thing until she could hopefully find her way out of it, if she could.
And thinking about some of those things that she does, and the pattern of relationships. So at one point in the novel, she is in therapy, in a kind of therapeutic community, for her love addiction. So can you tell us a bit about the love addiction, or your perspective on love addiction, and how that plays out in the book?
Yeah, sure. So love addiction was something that I discovered as I was writing this book, and I found it so interesting because it's basically this addictive pattern where you would, in the same way that, like, I don't know, a narcotic could destroy your life, like you could put some love interest on such, you could basically torpedo your entire life for a love interest. And that felt like something this character would do. And the thing about love addiction is, of course, like with all addictions, they are basically derived, they're like maladaptive coping mechanisms that stem from childhood trauma. And so it made sense to me that that it was at the level of like addiction for this character, and that there was indeed trauma behind it that needed to be explored. And that was what I was interested in. So that's how we ended up with love addiction and in the sort of clinic.
Do you think it's, I mean, that feels like that's a fairly extreme manifestation of some of these issues, but certain parts of the book and the patterns were quite relatable, I think, perhaps to a wide range of people. Certainly I could relate to some of the, that kind of yearning for everything that you don't have, and then as soon as you've got it, it's not as attractive anymore.
Right.
That kind of, a relationship, a place, whatever that is. But so do you think that that's a sort of a universal feeling, and that she takes it to an extreme?
I do, actually. Yeah, I do. Absolutely. I mean, like, who doesn't know what it feels like to want something so badly, and then when you have it, you don't want it anymore? Or like, who hasn't fallen in love with someone they can't have, right, at some point in their life? It's, of course, it's entirely relatable. And indeed with her, I think it's an extreme, but also it's like this constant pattern of it that brings it to this level of addiction. But at the same time, I will say that when I was writing this, I was sort of also questioning, and in the process and in the writing and in the book, in that section in the clinic, there's a lot of sort of mock humor. There's a lot of humor. So I was also, I think, kind of bringing levity to the sort of addiction and rehab trope, and trying to kind of question its value at the same time in the writing. Like, I wasn't just sort of earnestly writing through those scenes and sort of accepting them at wholesale. And she was so skeptical of the concepts that they were presenting, and of the fact of needing to be there, and of addiction and treatment and rehab and recovery, that I was, through her, sort of questioning all of that. And I sort of don't necessarily, the sort of investigation is kind of in the writing as well, because I do think about this. I'm like, well, on the one hand, but on the other, what is addiction? Like, what distinguishes something as addiction versus just like normal human behavior, right? So I was questioning all of that through her and through those scenes.
Yeah. And there was comedy, and there was cynicism and an ambivalence towards it, which was entertaining as well. And I wondered about how valuable was it that it was defined as an addiction? Did that mean that perhaps she didn't feel as responsible for her actions because it could be blamed on an addiction?
Totally. And that's like part of what I'm interested in exploring as well. Is like, when you have an addiction, does that mean like, oh, well, you can just say I have an addiction and therefore I'm not responsible? Or, I mean, for her, no, she has to like find her way out of it. There's no way around it, even if it is addiction or not. And in fact, and there's also like no real, I guess recovery is something I was also kind of questioning, because she gets out of there and not like she's healed necessarily. So yeah, I thought about a lot about all of that.
Yeah. And the kind of the compulsive side of the love addiction was interesting as well. And I wondered whether, you know, the way we communicate now, you know, social media, the ability to email somebody halfway around the world kind of fed some of that for her. The fact that she could email the woman in Paris and, you know, all of that sort of thing, maybe that ability to connect with people is not helpful for somebody who has those tendencies.
Yeah, I don't think it is helpful, because on the one hand, you feel like this connection. On the other hand, these connections are so tenuous and not real. And also social media helps to really feed fire to a fantasy, doesn't it? And because as we know, social media also isn't a real accurate depiction of reality, but it's hard to keep that in mind when you're consuming it. So indeed, I think technology does probably make things a lot worse.
Yeah. Do you think she genuinely fell in love or loved during the novel?
I think at some point she does. I think she's been loved and then rejects it, indeed. And then I think she does eventually feel love. But I think the times that she thinks she feels love, more often than not, are it's not love. It's infatuation, and it's seeking to fill some void, really. And where does that void come from, and how does one navigate it?
Yeah. So we've got some questions coming in on the chat as well, which is great. So just a reminder to everybody, you can add questions as well. So somebody has asked, would you say the protagonist's love addiction borders perhaps on erotomania or de Clerambault syndrome, for example, with the ambassador's wife?
Gosh, I wish I could answer that, but I have no idea what erotomania or de Clerambault syndrome is. But
perhaps tell us in the chat. The person who put that, please tell us in the chat. I'm hoping that somebody will explain what that is. I don't know what that is either. Somebody else has asked, do you think she would make a good mother?
You know, that's a good question, because sometimes when I was writing the book, I was thinking, like, wondering the same thing and wondering what would happen to her if she had to become a mother. I honestly think so, because I think that I think she's full of love, honestly, and just doesn't know how to direct it properly. And I think if she became a mother, she would have no choice but to direct it towards that child. And I think in that, which is the right person to direct love towards, right? Rather than like these fantasies. So I do think she would be a good mother, actually. And I really genuinely thought about that, because I thought about, I thought about that a lot. It's funny, you really think about all these different scenarios that the protagonist would be in when you're creating them, just to help bring them to life, even if those situations don't come forth in the novel.
Yeah. So they exist outside of the novel. They're
just like, and they tell you to do that in writing courses, you know, and I tell my students to do that too.
Great. So we've got an explanation. Thank you, Diva Magazine, who told us that erotomania is an excessive sexual desire or a delusion in which a person, typically a woman, believes that a person, it's moved around. A person believes that another person is in love, with them. So I guess there's something about the sexual desire, and maybe thinking that that's love, perhaps, or believing that somebody else is in love with you when they're not. So where the individual's attraction is so divorced from reality, it actually borders on delusion.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's a part of it. Indeed. I mean, I think that they're all sort of mixed up, is this like sexual desire, but also, I mean, it's interesting because it's like there's a sexual desire, indeed, and this like delusion that the person loves them back, but also there's this desire that comes from being emotionally sort of malnourished as a child in some way and craving that affection as well. And so I think they're very intertwined. And yeah, the answer is yes.
Yeah. And so my reflection is as well that whilst there was clearly a quite destructive pattern around the sex and the love addiction, that also it was really refreshing to read about that sexual attraction in somebody who perhaps had some mental health issues, perhaps was traumatized, but there was, although you said sometimes you're thinking, why is she doing this? There was also a suspension of judgment, I felt at times, that actually this is somebody who is enjoying sex and is kind of engaging in it. And yeah, great.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you felt that way. I mean, it was really important to me to write unflinchingly about sex as well. And so I think that's the other thing, is appetite is really this idea that she has, that she takes up too much space in the world, manifests in a sort of like, I think, suppression of appetite in some way with food. She's got an eating disorder at some point in her life, of course, with sex. And I wanted to sort of help overcome that as well, and to not have that appetite be stifled. And so it was important for that to be like asserted in the book, for her to be able to like have sex and like have it not be a shameful or shamed thing. And yeah, so yes.
Yeah. And that's still quite a radical thing to do. It shouldn't be, but it is in itself. So that's great. Somebody's asked on the chat, did you think about the character after publication?
Of course. Yeah, I did. I did indeed. And I don't know, I always hold her in my heart in some way. And I feel for her. And you said, like, you felt that she was written without judgment. I mean, I couldn't judge her. I felt empathy. I had to find empathy for her. And I did. And so, yes, I do think about her after publication. But less and less.
Okay. So there's some chat about the protagonist journaling too. So thinking of all her different crushes and how and when she first detected attraction.
Oh yeah, I remember that scene.
Yeah, absolutely. And so some of these have come from Emily, who says thanks.
Oh yeah. Welcome. And you're right, actually. Yeah.
Good. So would you say anorexia for her is a form of self-erasure?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and so like, I mean, again, I was really interested in how all these levels of self-erasure and unattainability like link together. I mean, it's funny because I studied philosophy as an undergrad. And I came to this book with when I first started writing it, it had so much more of a sort of like philosophical feel to it. And then I spent 6 years writing it as a novel. But I was interested in just these concepts. Like, for example, I guess I was just thinking about self-erasure, yes, indeed. And she's, because of this sort of shame that's ingrained within her by virtue of her mother, by virtue of her sexuality, by virtue of coming from a place in the world that is deemed like, that is without statehood and self-determination, right, as a Palestinian, and how that like lineage affects her psyche. I mean, it is really interesting to think about that. And it sort of comes to a head like in various lines in the book. So yeah, anorexia is a form of self-erasure.
And another way of reducing the space that you take up in the world.
100%, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked a bit about your writing process, because you said you'd go out for a run, you'd go to sleep, and then you think, I wonder what she's going to do tomorrow. Can you tell us a bit more about how, because this is your first novel, you've written short stories and essays and lots of writing before, but how did your writing process change for this?
So for this, I had to really it's interesting. It's so different. My goodness. I was in an MFA program in Iowa, and I was lucky to have time and space to be able to really just focus on the book. I taught as well while I was there. I still teach. I've been teaching for 12 years. And basically what I would do is wake up in the morning, write as long as I could until I had to go teach, which was great that I had to go teach, because you go nuts if you're just home all day writing. And so I would go teach and then come home and then read in the afternoons and then go running in the evenings. and then come home and often I would write while I was running. Like I would take notes, like things would come to my mind, things that had been marinating in the back of my mind would sort of come forward, and I would write them down really quickly on my iPhone, and then I'd run home and try and type them all out, or else like edit, with them in mind, and then I would stop and then wake up the next morning and do it all over. But it was like this, and then when I left Iowa, I was writing in New York, and that wasn't as much unencumbered time because of, money and work and all of that being much more, I don't know, crucial. And it was the sort of same thing. I always like to wake up before the world feels like it started, like where I don't have to check my email yet or my phone, and I can just write. Like the second I take my phone off airplane mode, I can't write anymore, even if no notifications or anything pop up. It's just that it feels like this boundary has been removed, and I'm suddenly like exposed in a way that takes me away from my creative brain.
So those boundaries are really important.
They are really important, yeah, to me as a writer.
And would you give that advice to other aspiring writers?
I do think it is important to sometimes block off like distractions in the world, indeed, even though you need to bump up against the world to write as well, because that's just where good writing comes from. But it's like striking a balance between blocking things, having that time blocked off from the world, and being immersed in the world. And so you immerse in the world and then you step away from it to write, and then you immerse in the world and then you step away from it to write, sort of that.
Yeah. And I like what you said about the running as well. So there's something about when you're outside and
and you're not like your unconscious is sort of left unrestrained in those times, and that things come forward in some way. A lot of my writing process involves trying to take my conscious brain out of the equation so that things can marinate and come forth when I return to the page.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. What are you reading at the moment, Zaina?
I'm rereading Jhumpa Lahiri because she's going to be the director of writing at Barnard, where I teach. Okay. And so I was thinking it would be nice to reread her work. But in addition to that, I just started reading a book called Little Rabbit that came out here in the States yesterday. Okay. And it's about a woman who has an affair with an older man. And it's interesting. A friend of mine edited it, and it's been pretty, I think, well received. And then I'm also, what else am I reading? I've been reading, that's what I'm literally that's what I'm reading right now. Jhumpa Lahiri and this book, Little Rabbit. I forget the author's name, Alyssa Songbridge or something. So yeah. And
I suppose what's next for you? What are you writing next?
I'm writing another novel as well as an essay collection. And the next novel is set between the Middle East and Europe rather than the States. And it deals with different art forms, like a visual artist rather than a writer. And then I'm working on an essay collection, which I always, about a lot about like diaspora and diasporic communities, and both of course have love as a central theme because that's one of my main interests. So that's what I'm working on.
Great.
To write in different genres.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading that second novel and the essay collection. That sounds really good. And so thank you so much. This has been brilliant. It's great to have the questions coming in from the chat as well, and so generous with your time, and it's been lovely to hear your insights into the book, which we really enjoyed. And so thank you so much, Zaina, and thank you everybody who's watching. You can watch again as well. So this has been great. Thank you for joining us in DIVA Book Club, and look out for announcements about our next read. Thank you.
Thank you.